welcome you to this important function that will involve two major actions. The first one is the Jubilee South Asia Pacific Movement and the Deputy Development and Friends of the Earth, UNFCCC, are launching a new online tool showing the emission cuts and finance transfers required by each country in 2025. So that's a very important activity, and that's one of the main reasons why we are here. Two, we shall have discussants talking about different themes and making different demands. And later on, there will be a press statement released. But before we go into all that, I want to welcome you all and ask you to be in solidarity with the people of the Philippines and the rights defenders. As you're well aware, the Philippines currently being affected by the typhoon, and this is a concern to all of us because this has an effect to the poor as a result of the climate change. Without wasting a lot of time, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce the discussants here. With me, we have Lady Nasipil from the Jubilee South. If she can wave at you. We have Alex Lafarouz, the second discussant. I'm sorry.
Equity consultant to Friends of the Earth Uni.
And we have Azeb Girmay, LDC Watch. And then we have Benjamin Ruiz. And we have Sylvan Kalfa, who is going to basically respond to some of the questions that the plenary may wish to ask. So without wasting a lot of time, let me call upon Lady Nasipil to discuss the situation at PH and also make the southern demands. Welcome, Lydia.
Yes, well, just briefly on the Philippines, I think you all know that as we are speaking today, this is actually the third year that the COP is being held, and at the same time the Philippines is being battered by a super typhoon. We saw this happen in Doha when we were gathered in Doha, then when we were gathered in Warsaw, and now here in Peru, in Lima. And this is really actually a reminder to the governments how dire the situation is for the vulnerable countries in the world, but also for all of the peoples in the world, because it is also a sign of things to come, not just for the countries in the south, for which many are already suffering, and as well as countries in the north. And I think this is a good opening to emphasize the urgency of the message that we want to deliver today. And that is, first of all, the great need for the governments to aim higher, to have a higher ambition. And this is being said in many hallways and in many discussions, but it hasn't been actually demonstrated in very concrete targets by governments, that there is a lot more that needs to be done than what the current pledges have demonstrated or have shown. So one of the urgent messages we have today is to show that we cannot just allow targets for mitigation to be determined individually by countries without referencing it to a global goal that would have to be based on science, and a goal that would ensure that we will be able to stabilize the Earth's temperature below 1.5. We know that the governments are working on 2 degrees, but for many people in the south, 1.5 is the absolute maximum that we will tolerate, because even at 0.8 degrees, which is the increase of temperature from pre-industrial levels, we are already suffering millions of displacement, tens of thousands of people dead in just one country alone, like the Philippines, and already major billions of dollars of losses in terms of livelihoods, agriculture, food crops, and so on. So we cannot tolerate beyond 1.5, and to ensure that we actually stabilize the Earth's temperature below that, we have to reference that to a scientifically based global goal. It cannot be, it is not acceptable for us for different countries to just simply work on what they're willing to contribute. We need to compare pledges and targets and programs for mitigation based on what the science tells us is what is required globally. The second urgent message that we have is that the effort that is needed to keep us below 1.5 or 2 degrees must be shared by all countries, but that must be shared in a fair and equitable way. And that is also based on science, because there is a way, as we all know, to account for the historical contribution to the problem of climate change. And based on these historical contributions, we can account for what should be an equitable and fair sharing of the effort, an equitable and fair sharing of what remains of the global emissions budget. So we are here today to discuss that, and the website which we are launching is all about how to demonstrate in a scientific way what those shares should be collectively for developing countries and developed countries, and individually for each country, and what we must say, what we think are the fair ways of sharing this effort. We also are launching a Southern statement, a statement by different movements and organizations from Southern countries about sharing of this effort globally, about the need for an ambition that is commensurate to what should be a global goal, what should be a shared goal of all countries, and how we think all governments must contribute, what the governments in the north or among developed countries should be aiming for, and what the governments in the south should also be aiming for. We are going to talk here a lot about what are fair shares and what are efforts that must be over and beyond our fair share. And just to give us more time for the discussion, I just want to end with this note that currently in the negotiations in Lima, there's a big fight about what the 2015 agreement should cover. And we know that this is an important fight because the agreement cannot just be about what the developed countries refer to as mitigation. For us, mitigation is certainly a very important part of the agreement, a very central part of the agreement. But mitigation is not just about targets for emissions reductions in each country. It should be about the finance that is necessary for us to meet the necessary emissions reductions contribution of all countries. And especially when we think about how mitigation in the north, the responsibility for mitigation in the north, even with the most extremely ambitious domestic actions in the north, their obligations are so huge that we have to take on part of it in the south to make it possible. And we cannot do that without the finance coming from the north. So mitigation is also about climate finance, despite what the governments in the north are saying that it should be off the table. We're also talking about how it's very important that these emissions be commensurate to the goal. And this is also what is being discussed in Lima today. And so we need to make sure that all the elements of an agreement should be included. Otherwise, the Paris Agreement will be doomed to fail even here now in Lima. The launching of the statement and the website, we hope will contribute to the push, the political push, so that governments will do right by us, even though we are saying, of course, that international negotiations is not just the only place where this should be secured. We are also determined to fight for this locally and nationally in our own countries, so that policies in each country will be consistent with the demands that we're making here in Lima today. Thank you.
Thank you, Lydia. I now call upon the next panelist, Alex, to talk about the key findings of the tool and show the chasm from current pledges to what is needed. Alex, please.
Thanks, John. In putting together the tool, what we were hoping to do was to answer the question of what adds up on climate change. At the beginning of last week, Friends of the Earth put out a strong call for the governments here to do the maths on climate change, to see what the actual physical limits we were facing were, and to raise their targets to be in line with those limits, to raise the amount of climate finance they were proposing to be in line with those limits. And so with this tool, what Friends of the Earth Union with partners is hoping to show is specifically, what does that mean? And we can see that if we want to be serious about limiting warming with a chance to keep it below 1.5 degrees, then that means that all countries in the world will need to have significantly lower emissions in 2025 than they do today. Every country in the world. And the only way to get there fairly, based on justice, is to recognize that that will require transfers of wealth, technology, resources from the north, from the countries that have the largest historical pollution, to those in the south to allow them to realize the transformation. And so this tool has been about, one, helping quantify and define how much those transfers might be with using underlying data from the IPCC. And we've been conservative. We use conservative costs and you know, in case things become more expensive, and we try and use conservative budgets as well. And to see how much those transfers might be, but also to see how deep the cuts in the north would need to be if we want to say we care about 2 degrees or 1.5. And when you look at the tool, which I hope that a lot of you will, you'll see that the cuts that we're talking about are 70%, 80% domestically, no offsets, done in the European Union, done in the United States in 2030. That's the scale of the reductions we need to see. And then those reductions need to be accompanied by the transfer of hundreds of billions of dollars a year to enable the same types of reductions actually in real, what the world sees terms in developing countries, in countries like India or in Bolivia or in Peru or in El Salvador or in Ethiopia. So when we come to this conference and we see that today the United States is facing its multilateral assessment, its review of its 2020 target, and its 2020 target is 4% below 1990 levels, 4% below 1990 levels, and we see that the European Union has talked about doing 20% below 1990 levels, which it's already at, so it's promising zero climate action between today and 2020, then we can see just how far these countries are from taking the action that is needed to actually address climate change. And we need to face up to that truth, that mathematical truth, that physical truth, and that justice-based truth. And that's why we're putting this on the table. So I'd encourage everybody to play around with the tool, to have a look, see what your country needs to do, how deep do the cuts need to be nationally, and how much finance they might need. What we've done is we've tried to break it down so you can see for each country what is its fair share of domestic reductions. Where should it be reducing its emissions domestically? And if they're a country of the north, where in addition how much extra they need to do in terms of transferring resources. And then for countries of the south, we've said what would be their fair share, because they're all, in sharing equitably, every country has a limit. And then where do their emissions actually need to go? So what would be their limit without finance and technology? And then where do they need to go with that finance and technology, the climate debt that should be provided? So that's what we've tried to do here. And I think that what we see is that as people who want to tell the truth about what's happening in this process, we can see that the truth is that we are on track for a climate disaster. That the climate crisis will worsen unless we drastically scale up the level of action that we're engaged in. At the moment, the Green Climate Fund is talking about $2.5 billion a year in finance. And the transfers need to be in the order of $1 trillion a year. $1 trillion, which is of course the US defense budget, or a fraction of what we spend subsidizing fossil fuels. So it's 1/10 of what we mobilized in 11 days to fight the global financial crisis. $1 trillion is the amount of money we will mobilize when we are serious about the climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. I now call upon the third panelist, Azeb, to